right. Welcome, everybody, to the Vermont Historical Society Virtual Speaker Series. For this season, we're excited to kick off our November talk with Joe Radner. Just a couple pieces of tech information. This is a webinar version talk, so it runs a little bit differently from meetings. You could still use the chat function to share information or ask questions. Please note that if you'd like everybody who's on the webinar to see your chat, you do need to choose everyone versus hosts and panelists. But the best and easiest way to ask questions is with the Q&A function, which does show up at the bottom of your screen. Captions are also available that you can enable for yourself. And again, as a webinar, if you do want to speak, you will need to raise your hand or again, put something in the chat, especially once we get to the question and answer section. And we'll make sure that we can either turn on your audio and or video and go from there. All right, so I think we'll get going on today. And again, very excited to have Joe Radner with us, who's the author of Wit and Wisdom, The Forgotten Literary Life of New England Villages. And Joe, before returning to her family home in Western Maine as a freelance storyteller and oral historian, spent 31 years as a professor at American University in Washington, D.C., where she taught literature, folklore, women's studies, American studies, Celtic studies, and storytelling. She has published books and articles in all of those fields. Radner received her PhD from Harvard University and is a past president of the American Folklore Society and the National Storytelling Network. Amazing. So I will turn it right over to her and we'll start.
Well, good afternoon. I'm honored to be here, and I have been wanting to talk to people in Vermont about this project for a very long time. So I'm glad to be with you. I'm sorry I'm in a little postage stamp in the corner of your screen, but maybe we'll make it worthwhile at any rate. What I want to tell you about is this project, and the project that led to this book, which came out last year, happened entirely by accident. In the 1980s, it fell to me, as maybe it has fallen to some of you, to empty the attic of a family house in Fryeburg, Maine. I had no idea that I was going to find anything more widely important than just the family information that I was interested in. And I was not inclined to linger and browse, because if you have been in a New England attic in the summertime, you know it's hot and dusty and airless. And I just took all the paper, and there was so much paper, and packed it away in boxes, and like a good pack rat, carried it off to someplace else. But years later, searching for family history, I opened one of those boxes, and on the top there was a jumble of handwritten sort of literary compositions. Some of them were in my great-grandmother's handwriting. I saw the afterglow suggested by a sunset off Mount Kearsarge. The sun is descending low, and o'er the mountain height streams a warm and crimson glow, with a soft, rich purple light. I could picture that. I could see Mount Kearsarge out my window. But then the next page was in a very different mode. It was a piece headlined, Local Brevities. Mr. Fred Farrington, while in Saco recently, was mistaken for a member of the last legislature and arrested. He was charged with burglary, arson, conspiracy, embezzlement, sedition, and false pretenses, sorry. Surprisingly modern, huh? So I turned to other pages. I found some doggerel alphabetical poetry, and I'm going to show you some things on the screen that are in manuscript. I don't expect you to be able to read them easily. I'll read them to you, but I thought you might like to look at what the stuff looked like. So there was this. And A is for the well-known Albion P, who thinks it's rather nice a county officer to be. B is for Barker, Frank, you know. With Miss May Ross, we think he will go. C is for Calvin, one who shaves staves, and his mind is all a flurry about one octave. D is for Deacon, and also for Dare, who went to snow the bridge and found Buzzle there. And it goes on. Now, I could tell that these were sly jokes, but what were they about? Who were they about? I don't know. I mean, some of it was interesting to me just as a person who was interested in 19th century rural work. You know, Calvin, who shaves staves. Calvin must have had a workshop in the ell of his house, and he made barrel staves and sold them on by piecework for a local barrel maker. That was interesting. And then the deacon who went to snow the bridge. Do you know what it means to snow the bridge? I bet some of you do, and some of you don't. Um, this is a typical bridge. This is the toll bridge after which the whole district where my family settled in Freiburg was named. And it's a typical covered bridge. And covered bridges were made that way in order to protect the wooden floor of the bridge from rot from water. But in the wintertime, people are not traveling on wheels, they're traveling on runners. And they need snow. So whenever it snowed, the neighbors had to get together and literally snow the bridge, shovel snow onto the bridge so that traffic could go across it on runners. So that was kind of interesting. Nevertheless, I thought, Great Grandma Adams had a very quirky hobby. And then I lifted another sheet and I found this truly unprepossessing document. And just before it hit the dump pile, I noticed a couple of things. I noticed that over there on the left side, it was stuck together. No, it was actually, it was actually sewn together. There were little stitches of, of string. And then right in the middle, very faintly, there was a pencil inscription. It said, Toll Bridge Journal, Volume 6, Number 3, March 12, 1870. Well, that was weird. Tollbridge Journal? Tollbridge, that little district where my family lived, it was just an area of scattered farmsteads. There were no public buildings, no stores, not even a church, certainly not a journal, not a newspaper. And it didn't look like a newspaper either, did it? It was handwritten, scraps of paper sewn in, some strange order. What was going on? How did this journal come about? And then I lifted that tattered cover and I found the answer on page 1. It was a piece headed Report of Last Lyceum. I didn't know, by the way, at that point, that in the 19th century, that word lyceum could mean a literary event of any kind. All I'd heard of was that urban American lyceum, in the cities and big towns where people paid subscriptions and they went to listen to lectures by traveling notables like Emerson, Whitman, and so on. But this was a very different thing. It starts out, the people assembled at the Tollbridge Schoolhouse last Saturday eve in goodly numbers. This is the Tollbridge Schoolhouse. It, in fact, is the only public building in Tollbridge. It still is to this day, although it's been moved from there as the iconic schoolhouse is put on the Freiburg Fairgrounds now. But that was all there was. So that's where this happened. The writer goes on, he said, I presume their object was to hear the eloquence of our Tollbridge debaters and listen to the able productions of Tollbridge contributors to the journal. Well, this lyceum evidently involved a debate by neighborhood people. Some of them were named further down in the description, and listening to the journal, which was produced by Tollbridge contributors, ordinary neighbors. And this report, as it goes on, is evidently a roast of the well-known forensic style of the local farmers who were the debaters. Then sewn in after that first essay, there was a bizarre miscellany. There was a sincere moral essay on the nature of virtue, followed by some truly corny jokes. Do you retail things here? Said the boy to the clerk in a general store. Yes, sir. Well, retail my dog then. Sorry. And then after that, there was another earnest essay entitled Men's Vanity, arguing that men are even more vain than women, with less justification. And then there was a riddle about my great-grandmother, suggesting that she was a flirt. There was a clever poem about an unfortunate young man named Sam, who, whenever he went to court a woman, kept falling down the stairs. And then interspersed in all of this were several odd items about how some local farmers had invested in sick pigs. What a lyceum. I was beginning to think the whole hamlet of Tollbridge had a quirky hobby. Then I was talking to other people about it. I was talking to Stan Howe, who was then the director of the Bethel Historical Society. And he said, oh, yeah, I think my family's got some stuff like that up in the attic in East Bethel. And he mailed me photocopies of some pages of just the same kind of stuff. So then I started to send out queries to historical societies and asking about these funny little journals. Most of the answers, and I didn't get many, were sort of on the order of, huh? But then I heard from a man named Matthew Thomas from the Fremont, New Hampshire Literary Society. That's in southern New Hampshire. And he sent me photocopies of 2 issues of exactly the same kind of journal. This one was called the Poplin Herald, and it was from 1879 and 1880. So this was odd, that's 100 miles away from Toll Bridge and a decade away. And in an era of slow travel, there was no influence between those two. So the Toll Bridge Lyceum was not a local curiosity. What I had actually stumbled on was evidence of a huge popular tradition of village lyceums all over the northern New England for most of the 19th century, a tradition that's been completely forgotten for more than 100 years. Realizing this took me many years and 2 fellowships, one of which took me to the Vermont Historical Society, and I was happy to have its help. I had to survey archives, historical societies, community historians, regional newspapers, diaries, letters, justly forgotten 19th century novels, and lyceum record books. I am amazed that the tradition has been so thoroughly forgotten. But I can say now, absolutely confidently, that there were hundreds of these rural lyceums, producing thousands of these handwritten journals in northern New England, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, between about 1830 and 1890. Of those thousands of journals, though, I have found only 70 in a couple of decades. And I've seen the record books of several other lyceums whose papers have been lost. So my sources are town and state historical societies, other attics, and so on. And I'm here to ask you to check your archives and attics. So here, I'll show you some maps to show you where these things are. This is a map that shows the locations of all the actual documents I have held in my hand. The round dots are lyceum papers. The square dots are lyceum record books, where they kept the Constitution and bylaws and the minutes of each meeting. This map shows the general area of the rural lyceums. If it could show all the rural lyceums that took place in that area, you wouldn't be able to see the map. It would just be covered with little black dots. So it is not a chance coincidence, by the way, that the same geographical spread at the same time period applies to those connected farmsteads. This is a map that was made by Thomas Hubka. I don't know if you know his book, Big House, Little House, Back House, Barn. It's a fascinating architectural study of the making of those connected farmsteads, the big house, little house, back house, barn, which were created either by moving buildings or by creating connecting buildings precisely at the same time, between about 1830 and 1890. So the distribution of those connected farmsteads, and you can see where it goes into and covers most of Vermont, as well as more eastern and northern parts of New England, that coincides pretty near precisely with the distribution of the lyceum papers. And demographically, it also coincides. The same people who made those houses made these journals and held these lyceums. So when you drive past one of those big, long, old farmsteads, you know what some of the people who first lived in those were doing. And we can talk in the Q&A if you want to about why there was that coincidence. But I want to show you another map because this one shows the location where some of the papers were found. Every little blip on this map represents a journal, one of these Lyceum journals that I had heard of before, up to about 8 years ago. They were referred to, a lot of them, in newspapers, in letters, diaries, all those sources. These dots don't necessarily represent the actual papers. I haven't held most of these in my hand. But these are just a few of the places. And I want you to look at Vermont. Vermont is represented by all the orange blips. You can see all the way from Derby down to the West Halifax in the south and over on the west, from North Ferrisburgh over to the east to East Cabot and that sort of area. All of Vermont was full of these lyceums. I did my least research in Vermont, I have to confess, because I'm rather far from Vermont, where I live. But I do know from doing historical research in newspapers that your state was completely full of lyceums. So I urge you to go and find them. You'll find them in the oddest places, and most archivists don't know what they are. So you'll find them in collections of family papers or miscellaneous poetry or whatever. But they're there, and they give you a tremendous insight into what your ancestors were doing. So for a minute, I'm going to jump over 10 or 15 years of research and take you into a typical meeting of one of those rural lyceums. It would be on a winter evening, only winter, between, say, October and March at the outside. And it would be in a very tiny hamlet, not a town, but maybe an outlying hamlet in the town, in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and a little bit in rural Massachusetts. These meetings were usually held weekly in the wintertime in, between, as I said, 1830 and 1890. And they were attended by all kinds of people in the neighborhood, men and women, old and young, down to sort of older common school pupils. The energy came from young adults. They'd set them up, but everybody from the local minister and school teacher to farm workers would be there at the Lyceum. You picture the neighborhood, scattered farms. They would travel on these dark, cold, stormy evenings on horseback, in wagons. Nothing comfortable about that. They would go many miles. They visited other lyceums that were sometimes 10 or more miles away. And all of these lyceums were held in one-room schoolhouses. This is a picture that I was lucky to find. It shows you what the interior of the Tollbridge schoolhouse looked like in the 19th century. You can see those rows of rough wooden benches, and then there would have been a matching set of benches on the other side of the wood stove. For good reason, everything focused around the wood stove. And then at the back, you see a platform where the teacher would have stood, and a desk and a blackboard. So men and women, they would bring lanterns, so there would be light. They would bring fuel for the wood stove. The men were probably on one side and the women on the other. I want to share with you some things from the book. And this is one of my favorite things, actually. This is a description of a meeting of a lyceum in Centerville, Vermont in 1865. The attendee who reported it was not a native of the village. He was from the local town, and he was writing a report to the regional newspaper, and he evidently thought he was going to find bumpkins doing something stupid, but he was quite impressed at what he found. He said, the little schoolroom was crowded to its utmost capacity, and in the regular Yankee style, with the ladies on one side and the gentlemen on the other, thus affording ample opportunity for that innocent pastime casting sheep's eyes among the younger and more impressible portion of the audience. So picture that, and picture the activities. Every lyceum had a constitution and bylaws. They loved these kinds of litigious sorts of things. And then the minutes. There was a kind of ritual structure that was established by the Constitution. There were some minor things that happened in the lyceums that were not mentioned in the Constitution and bylaws, but certainly attracted people. Some people would bring songs. There might be a lecture by a local dignitary. There might be comic dialogues. The younger kids, the older common school children, had parts. The girls did recitations of memorized poetry, and the boys did declamations, memorized martial speeches and political talks. But the central activity, the thing that was prescribed in the constitutions, were two. First, the debate, and then what they called the paper. The debate was serious. This was the center of the Lyceum. It was mainly men. Later in the century, a few women debated, but it was largely a male activity. And two men were appointed on the affirmative and two on the negative the week before, when the topic of the next week's debate was announced. And they would spend the week preparing. They debated interesting topics, a lot of stuff on matters of national policy, which means they read the newspapers. They were not ignorant. They debated the abolition of slavery. They debated capital punishment, immigration, pretty common modern topics as well when you think about it. They debated philosophical matters. Is ambition a vice or a virtue? And a really hot topic, is the mind of woman as susceptible of education as the mind of man? And they debated historical matters. Some of those actually surprised me. One topic that was argued in more than one place was, has America done greater harm to Indians or to Africans? That surprised me. When the assigned debaters finished, the topic was thrown open to the whole audience and people could weigh in on different sides. Finally, there was judging, either by the president or by a board of judges, some of whom were women. And then there was often a recess, and after the recess came the reading of the paper. Everyone was excited about that. Just like the debaters, the editor of the paper rotated from week to week and was assigned each week. It was usually what they called the editress, because it was usually a woman. And she worked all week too. She had to get pieces. She had to convince her neighbors to write. And everybody was supposed to write, but they were nervous about it. Here's a sample. I found written in pencil attached to one of the pieces that was submitted to my great-grandmother, who was the editor of a paper in Toll Bridge. Dear Miss Adams, herewith find something for the paper, which I trust may be suitable. If you can't read it, send it back, and I will hang it up in the cornfield this summer to scare crows. No, the editor had to do a lot of encouraging. Writer's block is not new. They wrote, most of the editorials they wrote were encouraging people to write for the paper. They threatened people, they wrote satires, they wrote poems. Here's one sample. 'Twas the night before Lyceum, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. An editress sat all alone in her chair, in hopes that contributors soon would be there. That was in a paper called The Gem of the Valley from West Plymouth, New Hampshire. So the neighbors did write, though, and they wrote a tremendous variety of material. Their ears from early childhood had been full of so many different kinds of literary examples. They heard a lot of poetry. Poetry was read, poetry was memorized in the schools. Um, and they imitated popular poetry. I would say, the poetry, my friend Pauline Greenhill wrote a book on folk poetry in which she said it tends to be timely rather than timeless. Here's a bit of a poem in praise of books. You are friends to the young, you are friends to the old, your pages are light, they mysteries unfold. You are solace in trouble, you gladden our way and make the dark night as resplendent as day. Then they wrote essays, essays about virtuous action, essays about the brevity of life, the nearness of death, the joys and sorrows of marriage, the risks of farming, serious stuff. And then they wrote humor. All of these serious things were embedded in a matrix of humorous pieces that took off from all areas of their literary experience. Of course, they all read the Bible. They were raised listening to the Bible. They had it in their brains. And they imitated it in lots of ways. Here's one bit from Carthage, Maine. My wife's commandments. Thou shalt have no other wife but me, nor shalt thou in thy sleep dream of other women. Thou shalt not get drunk, nor go to bed with thy boots on. Thou shalt not stay out after 9 o'clock at night, or snore at my side, or kick in thy sleep. They also wrote biblical chronicles, kind of parodies of the Bible. Here's one about the gold rush. Chronicles chapter 5. And it came to pass toward the latter part of the reign of Jared, king of the realm of New Hampshire, even the granite country, that Jericho, called also Andover, this is from Andover, New Hampshire, and the whole valley of Jehoshaphat went away after strange idols. And it goes on, making fun of people who went to the gold rush. They were also familiar with legal documents, and they did a lot of writing about parodying legal documents. Here's the Kimball Hill Blue Laws. Try and find that. That's from East Bethel as well. It shan't be lawful for Etta Bartlett to be courted Sunday night unless her mother sits in the room and takes notes. It shan't be lawful for Jim Bartlett to kiss Etta more than 3 times a day unless by her request in writing. It shan't be lawful for Mel Howe to court Grace in the schoolhouse unless Henry is present. So on. As some of these examples shows a lot of teasing about courting, and that's because the big energy to get up the lyceums came from young adults, many of whom were unmarried, so they had considerable interest in courting. They also, as you can see from this thing that's still on the screen, they also took place, the lyceums, in a schoolhouse. So the things that they did in school invaded their literary awareness. They did parodies of school lessons. They were taught poetry, of course, in the schools. They were taught about metaphor and similes, and they loved to write similes. Here are a couple of samples, and this is teasing, of course. As the bark is to the birch, so is Lizzie Berry to Mel Murch. As the quilt is to the bed, so is Celia S. to Holt's Fred. As the fire is to the coal, so is Almond to Ellen Toll. Those are kind of hot, but this one is the weirdest I've ever noticed. As the fine comb is to lice, so is Hattie Gilman to Wallace Tice. Figure that one out. There were some jokes that I never understood. They also made jokes about the grammar lessons they had in school. They called it parsing, learning grammar. Here's one. John Staples is a common noun, third person, singular number, masculine gender, and the subject of Jesse Brown. George Dunning is a pronoun and agrees with Carrie Newman. George Staples is an adjective and belongs to Cora Brown. Everett Newman is an adverb and modifies Ada Holt. They also parodied a great deal. what they were in fact modeled on: newspapers. They were writing a paper, and they used and parodied, mostly parodied, a lot of the different kinds of forms that they read in the local and regional newspapers. So, for instance, um, Lost, a very small pasteboard box containing a pinch of ashes, this being all that remains of a true heart devoured by the flame of love kindled by that false-hearted lass, Hattie Gilman. Any person finding the same will please return it to its owner, Will Abbott. That came from East Cabot, Vermont, by the way. The Monitor of East Cabot, Vermont, January 9th, 1878. Or Marriages. The upright, notorious Frank Morse and the surpassingly beautiful Florence Field were united in the holy bonds of Dorlock. The poor fellow had to walk home in the rain, saying it was the first time she ever turned the key on him. She would never have a chance to do it again. Adults were teased over and over again for bad behavior in marriage, elopement. There is a wonderful piece on elopement that is a little long, but if you want it, we'll read it in the Q&A. It's the funniest thing I've read ever. And there were also a lot of teasing about blunders that adults made, particularly farming errors. They were quite esoteric. You can't sometimes figure out what people did because everybody knew. They took pieces, and then the editress, she'd get the neighbors to write this stuff, and then in the week she'd collect it. She'd pick what she wanted. She had to create a paper that was going to amuse huge range of people, from school kids to the local minister and the teacher and all the farmers and men and women, an amazingly diverse audience, a whole schoolroom full of people. And it had to entertain them for a long time. And listening to something read is not like reading it. You can't skim every word, whether it's written by an artist or a school child, gets the same length of time. It's not easy to create a paper to hold everyone's attention. So what the editors did was they made it a jumble of contents, wit and wisdom, wit and wisdom, wit and wisdom, like the New England weather. If you don't like it, just wait a minute. You can wait for the next piece and it might be to your taste. Then the editress would make a fair copy of what she had selected, made it in her own handwriting, partly so she could read it because she had to perform it out loud, and partly to protect the anonymity of all the contributors. Every one of these pieces was anonymous. One of the big games going to a lyceum was guessing who wrote which piece about whom. So, and the response, of course, the response to the paper could be quite enthusiastic. Here's that writer about the Centerville Lyceum in Vermont again, describing it. The end of his piece, he writes a little P.S. N.B. Nervous old bachelors and old maids who are inclined to faint or be hysterical are seriously advised not to visit the Centerville Lyceum, because the boys who are present in large numbers will applaud anything that gratifies them or touches their risibles with the most vociferous stamping and clapping, the shrillest whistles, and the most demoniacal yells. These were not sober, quiet occasions, these lyceums. They were vigorous. Evening began with a man's voice. The secretary, who was always a man, reading the minutes. You know how those meetings that begin with the minutes go. You've been at several of them. But it ended with a woman's voice. Almost always, the editress reading the paper, in effect, just sharing the whole community conversation. There was an unusual prominence of women in lyceums, and that's an interesting thing to think about. And then what happened at the end? Again, something important. People went home. And that was another big thing. Who were you going to go home with? If you went alone to the lyceum, could you walk home or ride home with someone else? They loved to write about their lyceums. They wrote poetry about them. This is a poem from South Levant, Maine, describing a whole lyceum. And I'm going to share with you just the very end, um, the part that describes what happens at the end of the lyceum. And when 'twas finished and all was o'er, we've lingered bashfully around the door. And when that one of all the rest has kindly granted our request, then up the horseback chill and bleak we quickly turned our willing feet, or past the shop beyond the mill, and wished the way was longer still. We smiled to think we should not fear if all the world should know and hear. And when at last with sweet good night we're left alone in the silent night, in some mysterious way we find we've left our courage all behind. We know they'll rhyme or prose about it, and well we'll wish we hadn't done it. And so through all our life it goes, our joys are mingled with our woes. People went home. And what happened to the paper? My guess is that it was almost always thrown away, or maybe more practically, it wound up in the family privy. No lyceum had an archive. The papers weren't kept at the lyceum. They were kept by the editors. And if the editor didn't want it, it went away. I think that's why I have found so few when there were thousands of them. And the ones I've found tend to come in piles of two or three of different dates, but the same editor or the same family of editors, which suggests to me that only if the editor herself or himself sometimes kept the papers have they been preserved. And that's why, again, you need to look at all the attics you've got still around, as well as in some of the historical societies and their archives. So, why did those farm neighbors maintain their lyceums? They risked frostbite, public embarrassment over and over and over across northern New England for some 60 years. Well, part of it was obviously sociability, but there were so many other opportunities for sociability and courting in the wintertime. Visiting, dances, circles, which were kind of community potlucks that happened all the time at different houses, meetings, prayer meetings, church, all of those were opportunities for sociability. They also did it for fun because they loved mind play. They loved word play. They knew words and they loved to jiggle with them. Also, in a more serious vein, they shared a sense of value with each other, and they found it important to say that over and over again. Preserve the small community preserve their way of life. They really cared about that. Even the teasing could work to preserve the community. For example, I mentioned that there were pieces in the Tollbridge Journal that I found about farmers having invested in diseased pigs. Well, it happened that some Freiburg farmers took very bad advice from a good farmer neighbor, and they happened to buy some diseased hogs that subsequently died. Now, that's the kind of event in a little farming village that can lead to real trouble, rifts, blame, and generations-long divisions. But it didn't. Instead, because of the Lyceum, it became an occasion for literature. The Tollbridge writers had a field day. They created a brief news item headlined, "No Certainty in Hogs." They created a notice of a forthcoming scientific lecture upon the subject of hogology. They created a mock recipe for soap making, ridiculing the economics of buying a sick pig solely for its lard. Obtain a live pig of JWR, dress it nice, cut into many pieces, try it out. You can get 12 pounds of fat worth 10 cents a pound, making $1.20. Price of pig, $3. Labor, $2.25. Good economics there. And they also wrote a long mock biblical epistle of John to the people of Tollbridge, narrating the melancholy history whereby was fulfilled the prophecy, the desolation of the pig pens spoken of by the prophet John. Now, this hog scandal in the papers, it wasn't news to any of the Lyceum members, of course. Everybody in the schoolhouse already knew about it and was appreciating the art with which it was portrayed. This little schoolhouse, they knew, which kind of reminds me about a comment that I think was attributed to Stephen King, that the reason that people read local newspapers is not to find out what happened, but to find out who got caught at it. Might be it. But in fact, I'm going to stop the share for just a minute because you've seen little of it. In fact, though, I would say that it was more than getting caught that was important here. The community is close enough so that people have to be able to take a joke. And the jokes can blunt the sting of this kind of private gossip. Again, as I say, I think they're preserving community by doing this. But the most serious conscious purpose of the Lyceums and the papers was to improve their minds. I mentioned to you that the founders of Lyceums, these young men, mostly young men and women, they loved to write the constitutions. And they always prefaced their constitutions with a sense of what their purpose was. And here's a typical one. This is the 1850 Constitution of the South Acworth, New Hampshire Association for Mental Improvement. The Lyceums had all kinds of names. They were called debating societies, reading clubs, whatever. And they were also given pompous names like the Association for Mental Improvement or Mutual Improvement, and so on. Anyway, here's the preamble to that Constitution. Whereas the general intelligence is of vital importance, the general diffusion of intelligence is of vital importance, and whereas is the surest safeguard of republican principles and the most efficient means for the suppression of vice, error, and crime, and whereas we, the citizens of South Acworth, believe there is no way better calculated to preserve such results than by an interchange of sentiments and opinions, we do therefore agree to form ourselves into a society, the object of which shall be the improvement of the various faculties of the mind. It's serious language, and they meant it. They were concerned with self-education beyond the common school. They saw the common schools, the public schools, as a preparation for lifelong learning. And in the Lyceums, they were actually conducting their own education, their own adult education. And they were preparing themselves to be responsible citizens. I want to give you a little sample of a man's summary looking back on his participation as a young man in the Lyceum in Candia, New Hampshire. He wrote, "The Candia Lyceum is in New Hampshire. The Candia Lyceum, as it was way back in the years of the calendar, has been a help to me in all my school and journalistic life, and I am positive that it has been a decided help to those boys who now occupy the pulpit and to those who have made their mark in the legal profession. And it has been a substantial aid as well to the boys who have remained at home on the old farm and to the girls who took an active part therein. To be able to speak in public and to discuss before an intelligent audience matters of current interest is an accomplishment that everywhere counts." They meant it. And think about how these Lyceums were happening at a crucial time in Northeastern history. Think about what you know about the 19th century in Northern New England. It was a period of tremendous economic change. Farm produce was streaming in from the west. It was easier to bring it in from the west in trains than it was to grow it finally in New England. There was that challenge. There also mass manufacturing was coming up and driving out all of the home industries like the Calvin who shaved staves, all the home industry that was typical. And there were lots of challenges to traditional ideas of family farming and local industry. And young people were leaving for those manufacturing cities. They were going west to find farms that didn't grow rocks. And those hill towns, those little hamlets, were depopulating at this time very rapidly at the same time that the American population was doubling. So these papers are the rarely heard voices of the folks who faced those pressures and people who thought that their traditional way of life was superior to the new, and they dearly wanted to preserve it. They were creating a model for democracy writ small. People loved their lyceums as neighborhood communities. And I'm just going to share my screen for a moment to show you one other thing. Where is it? Here we go. One other thing. And this is the end of that poem that I read a little bit of about going home from the Lyceum. This is the very last stanza of that closing piece. And it kind of sums up what they thought. He said, "When time has left its blighting trace on this dear and hallowed place, then whene'er the Grand Master may call us away from the trials and troubles of life's fleeting day, from the reading club on earth which our hearts dearly love, may we all meet at last in the grand club above." I think what they're saying is that the Lyceum is a foretaste of heaven. And of course, they knew what heaven looked like, right? Sorry, that's a cheap joke. But quite seriously, that's what this whole project has been about. To look at the aspirations of these people and their writings, which I think can't be found anywhere except in a few haddocks and archives and in Wit and Wisdom right now, and to share that with you so that we know more about our ancestors. So I'm going to stop the share now, and Eileen, if you'd like to have us, if there are any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Wonderful. Thanks you so much, Joe. I think I certainly appreciate your mention. Anyone who's done newsletters of the trying to hound people to write articles for you, I
Yep.
think was a great thing to see.
It is not a new thing, is it?
So I do have at least one question, but again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat. And Bill, you've had your hand up for a while, so I just want to make sure if you still have a question, please put that in the chat or let me know and I can unmute you. But our first question comes from the Waterbury Historical Society, and they're asking, what are some of the key differences between lyceums and Hypatia Club, besides the composition of members? And so there's the Waterbury Record,
I
which is
don't
the
even know
newspaper.
what a Hypatia Club is. Why don't you tell me what a Hypatia Club is?
Excellent.
It sounds
So yeah,
it sounds rather more urban than these things, but I don't know.
yeah. So they say in the paper that they have a lot of information, quite a bit from Waterbury's Hypatia Club, which later became the Waterbury Women's Club, and sort of notes about Lyceum meetings in the paper, but they don't
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of items from Lyceums in their archives. So
That's too bad. Yeah, but if the um, women's clubs became, were more and more popular as the 19th century advanced, and they were by and large they took place in areas where the lyceums did not. These rural lyceums, because think about the kinds of neighborhoods that had the lyceums. There were scattered farmsteads. Women were working hard. It was not something they couldn't go and get together at somebody's house very often for a club, reading books and that sort of thing. They could do the evenings. And they could go when they couldn't go by themselves, but they would go often, with friends, with family, with parents, whatever. But the settings for the women's clubs, and I gathered that Hypatia was one as well, um, were usually towns where people lived closer together and where women weren't working so hard on a daily basis to just keep the family together. So that would be the big difference. And also that they were women's clubs. And these were really seriously coeducational. And women had a lot more to say and to do than anybody realizes in these lyceums. I can talk more about that, but maybe there are other questions.
Great. And actually, it looks like I did not have the chat turned on properly. So now the chat is turned on properly. So you can also put stuff in the chat. But while Cheryl from Waterbury is sort of putting a little bit more in, we do have a second question. We'll sort of start with Lisa asks, your map showed that you found info in the Ferrisburgh area and a lyceum in Vergennes. And she just wants to know if they are discussed in the book. And they are.
Actually, the sad thing is the only actual papers that I have held in my hands from Vermont are the ones in your society, and they are from East Cabot and West Danville, not terribly far apart, and they are from the same family of editors. I have not, I was never able to do a personal trip around Vermont. And I think that there is a huge amount to be found, because if you just simply go to search the regional newspapers, it's particularly obvious after the Civil War, when the regional newspapers had columns of reports from different villages. And it's those columns where you find, and the such and such lyceum met, and this was the subject of the debate, and Miss So-and-so read a spicy and delightful paper. They were often called spicy, which is kind of nice. So I know from that kind of research that there was stuff in the Ferrisburgh area all the way up the state. I mean, but I haven't actually seen it and haven't found it, because, of course, when you write to people, they don't know they have it. You have to go and look. So wherever you are, go and look. You'll find it, and it will be interesting because it will give you some insight into what people were doing in those big farmhouses.
Great. And just a quick follow-up from Cheryl. The information about the Hypatia Club was founded in the 1880s by Miss Ella Carpenter and several other young teachers on the staff of Central School, and was originally called the English History and Literature Study Club.
Very
So,
good.
Fantastic.
Very good. So that would have been actually in town.
Yeah.
Not in a village, yes. Oh, I see that there's now something. Now we have a chat. I hadn't seen a chat. That's lovely.
I know.
Okay.
I did my tech wrong, but now we got it.
Yeah, they held. It's interesting. Yes, you talk about being held at the high school in town. There's an immense fluidity in the whole phenomenon of lyceums and debating societies in the 19th century. Debating was loved, and so was mental improvement. And by and large, these were extracurricular. Sometimes they were founded in high schools and academies. They were very often, and they were not curricular, they were extracurricular. And when that happened, they were often open to the town. And I've seen instances where going in both directions, where a local lyceum moves into an academy. Excuse me. When a local lyceum moves into an academy and then remains partially academy, partially local. And I've seen instances where an academy lyceum will open itself to the town and then actually become a local village institution. But debating was very important. There's a cutoff point, though. In the lyceums that were solely located in the academies, and they also took place in normal schools, and both women and men and coeducational groups founded them in the normal schools in the 19th century. They don't have the kind of teasing literature that we find in the village lyceums. They have serious essays, that sort of thing, people getting their papers corrected by their peers and that sort of thing. But you don't get the teasing, you don't get the the sense of the community conversation that you do in the rural lyceums.
Uh, Bill has a note. One related subtext is how many of the intellectual giants of the Gilded Age were raised in these small hill towns immersed in this tradition. Hartford area examples include Charles Dudley Warner and Horace Bushnell and William Cullen Bryant.
That's absolutely true. And a lot of those folks wrote later on in their memoirs things about how much they have learned in their youth in those lyceums, in those little rural lyceums. We live in an exceptionally literate region.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This question, do you feel the lack of opportunity for regulated civil debate at the local level or the lack of modern lyceum spills over today to a lack of mutual tolerance and respect for differing opinions?
Well, if that's a question about the evolution of the lack of tolerance for debate, I couldn't say. I think that the path is rather more complicated than that was indicated. But I will say that some of the rules of debate that I have read in the 19th century have led me almost to tears. One of the rules for debate that I've read, and it was common in manuals about debating, is listen to your opponent as though he might be right. People laugh when I quote that. We don't do that anymore. We're not open-minded in the same way. But what these people in the lyceums believed was that you could improve your mind by reading. You could study, but the real way to improve your mind was by engaging face to face with other minds. And that's what they were doing in the Lyceum, that face-to-face debate and careful listening. When they judged the debates in the Lyceums, they didn't judge them on the basis of which side was right. They judged them on the basis of which side had done a better job of arguing. They were very careful about the strategies of argument. Yeah. I want to put in the chat, if I can put it for everybody, I can. I'm going to put my email address, because I'd be happy to hear from anybody who has any more questions about this whole phenomenon. And I'd love to hear from you if you find something. And I'm also happy, I understand that the Historical Society for some reason hasn't yet managed to acquire any copies in the shop of Wit and Wisdom, and I can send you one. I'll give you my discount. The list price is, I think, $25 or $26.95. I'll send it to you for $25 including postage. But and you can send me a check to Joan Radner. But whatever you want to do. Anyway, you can also get it from Amazon and from bookshop.org. If you don't know bookshop.org, I believe in them because that's a mail order book distributor that supports independent bookstores.
Right.
Worthwhile.
And it sounds like we are working at it on our bookstore. Sounds like there were some delays. Hopefully we'll get it soon, but if not, definitely pick up a copy. There's a lot of great stuff in there that we didn't have time for. One of the things I really loved was the chapter about actually the performing of the papers, which I think is kind of this other piece that's really intriguing. Yeah. So one last question, I think, before we wrap up. Were they strictly a New England phenomenon, or have you come across any evidence that they took place in southern New England, upstate New York, or mid-Atlantic areas?
That's a good question. I was baffled by that. I did actually go to the Rhode Island Historical Society. I got in touch with the Connecticut Historical Society, Massachusetts. I said rural Massachusetts in the Berkshires, they did have lyceums. And by and large, they weren't of the same sort. I think that economics, were different in southern New England. Upstate New York is an interesting situation because actually, when the Yankees moved, and they did, talk about the Yankee runway going to the Midwest, um, they took a lot of their customs with them. And if you look at the places where people from northern New England settled in the Midwest, or what was then called the West, as far as Kansas even, sometimes they went out there and started lyceums. They didn't last long because they didn't have the same village setups, but they tended to take the lyceums because it said, this is home and this is who we are. Similarly, some of the troops in the Civil War set up lyceums in the Union Army camps. Um, and upstate New York was part of that diaspora. So I think, you can cross the Connecticut River and there's still some lyceums. I just didn't extend that far. Mm-hmm. But I see that as part of the Yankee runway westward, the beginning of it, and there's more of it there.
Wonderful.
Definitely.
Yeah, so wonderful. Thank you again so much. This was an amazing talk, and I think we all have our marching orders to go look for these papers or these records, and email you if we find anything. And I definitely recommend everyone to get the book.
I hope you will, because they are a hoot.
Wonderful. Thanks again. Thank you, Joe,
Okay.
and thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you